Stephanie Ross from my university in the labor studies, and who's co-director right now of the Center for Research and Work in Society, and a writer on Canadian unions and social movements over the years.
Well, let me first start by saying thank you to Eric Canepa in particular for inviting me to participate in this panel and to speak to a room of amazing activists and intellectuals, people that I've worked with and read about and read their work, and it's a bit of a humbling experience for me. So anyway, I'm very grateful, and I hope that I can make a useful contribution to our conversation tonight and over the next few days. I'm going to take it down to the level of sort of where the social movement and labor movement left in North America is at, and try to take stock of the capacities that have or have not been built over the last 2 months. And maybe I'll start by saying that, what a difference a year makes. If I'd been asked to talk about the state of the North American left's response to the crisis a year ago, I would have probably launched into a pretty depressing litany of stories of noble but fragmented resistance, some brutal acceptance of very strategically important concessions on the part of many working class organizations, despite resistance that they had put up, but also just a condition of defensiveness and political disorientation, even while there were, of course, through that period, some hopeful but very nascent and difficult attempts at regroupment on the left, not least of which was happening in Toronto. But since the emergence of a new global, what we can call a cycle of contention or a protest cycle, and in particular the emergence of Occupy as the most visible mass movement in response to the crisis in North America, I think the terrain of struggle has changed significantly, and it's important to take stock of that. I suppose that most of us here are probably likely to see that our optimism of the will and our conviction that human beings will actually say no to the degradation of capitalism wasn't just a delusional fantasy. And so I would say it's nice to feel somewhat hopeful again. But that said, I think it's also true that we continue to face many very serious, complex problems on the left, both because of the ongoing and rapid transformations in economic and political life that Leo in part talked about and Greg mentioned, but also within our movements themselves. And those problems haven't been simply swept aside by the emergence of Occupy or mass resistances elsewhere. And that's because protest cycles, when they emerge, they don't just come out of nowhere. They don't just create themselves sui generis. Right? They always exist on the basis of the residues or legacies of past struggles. So while it's true, and I think we can observe, and I want to talk a little bit about what new meanings, new tactical repertoires, new solidarities, and new organizational capacities the Occupy movement has pushed to the fore, made possible. We shouldn't necessarily assume that those new possibilities do away with or trump all of the problems that previous cycles of struggle have left us with. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, because I think now that a lot of the encampments have been swept aside, there is a real possibility for disillusionment that, this particular protest cycle didn't produce the victory or the new way forward that we were hoping for. But I think it's important to keep in mind that's never the case, that it's always the case that a protest cycle gives us an opportunity to take stock of both what is now possible, but also what are the lessons that we still have not learned and that we still have to grapple with moving forward, the political habits and that continue to be problematic. So I want to talk about Occupy in that context, and in context of trying to take stock of what's new and what kind of political possibilities have opened up, but also what I see as the sort of the ongoing limits or contradictions that we now face, given the kind of the political practices that have emerged over the last several months. And I guess in some ways I'm comparing Occupy to the previous round of struggle, what we might call the Seattle round. And I would count also the G20 protests in Toronto as sort of part of that round, primarily influenced by the tactics and the ideas that come from 1999 onward. So if I could I'll just sort of summarize. I think in terms of what's new, or at least what's been renewed by Occupy, are sort of four aspects. One is on the ideological and discursive level, that there's no doubt that Occupy has been an incredibly effective intervention in the war of position, in the contest over the common sense of our society. And in a way that the labor movement or other social movements, and even the Seattle round of social movements really weren't able to do. I think that the Occupy movement has penetrated far beyond the usual suspects into the broader population in a new way. And I think that's something that we want to think about, take stock of. The second thing is a renewed tactical repertoire. Whereas I would say that the Seattle round brought us certain kinds of tactics like which primarily had to do with chasing summits around the world, engaging for sure in forms of civil disobedience, but also involving black bloc tactics, obviously a contentious debate in any room of leftists. And forms of decision-making, horizontal decision-making, and experiments with participatory and deliberative democracy. In some ways, those tactics took place in an episodic way. And what's different, I think, about Occupy is the way in which that the movement has taken seriously the need to prefigure new social relations. So the tactic of encampment, in particular, as putting something very novel in the experience of the left, or at least novel for the experience of most of us. It's not an unheard of tactic. Even in North America, encampments have been used by protest movements as a way to bring certain kind of visibility and be not invisible in the eyes of those that hold power. But it isn't something that has had that kind of mass participation that we've seen here. And there are a few other tactics that I want to mention there as well that are new. The third thing is a renewed set of alliances between a variety of elements of the social movement and labor left that I think were really left in tatters after the Seattle round. Although, as I'm going to say later, I think that those alliances are very fragile. And then fourth, I'd say that there continue to be innovations in horizontal, democratic, and organizational capacity that are really important. So let me elaborate a little bit more on some of these elements, and then I'll talk about what I think are some of the limits or difficulties in each of those areas as well. So in terms of the discourse of Occupy and its importance, the language of the 1% and the 99% is a very vivid frame in which to place individuals' experiences of economic hardship. It's a frame that has had a resonance that is unlike all of the other talk that we've had of economic inequality. It's not as though there hasn't been talk of economic inequality in the past 10, 15, 30 years. But there's a resonance that has had, and we can see that both in terms of the way that people have taken up the language in daily life, talking about the 1% and the 99% in particular kinds of ways. We can see it in the way that on the internet, the Tumblr, the website, We Are the 99%, which is, I think, if you haven't seen it, is really worth looking at in terms of, random individuals writing their story on a piece of paper and framing their own personal experiences in terms of being in the 99%, identifying with the mass of people who have been harmed by capitalism. And, we can see that on the right, there is an acknowledgement that this discourse has really penetrated. And I think that partly explains some of the really very disingenuous commentary that, we don't really get what they're talking about. They get what Occupy is talking about. And, so Republican strategist Frank Luntz recently said to, a room full of Republicans, "I'm so scared of this anti-Wall Street effort. I'm frightened to death. They're having an impact on what the American people think of capitalism." So they know what the Occupy movement is about, and they know that it actually has had an impact on the way that people think about the prevailing economic and political order. And I think that has put into motion a kind of a politicization beyond, as I said, the usual suspects that we see in our social movements, and that's really important. In some ways, and as Leo was saying, the unwillingness to be what someone else has called politically obedient, to obey not civilly disobedient, but politically disobedient, right? To refuse to play by the kind of the rules of the political game that has been set out of electoral politics, of making policy demands, of seeking certain kinds of reforms, of actually focusing on the system and the systemic problems, and obviously raising the question of whether or not those problems can be dealt with within the system is really quite important and shouldn't be underestimated. A few things on the tactical repertoire of encampment. I think that it's also a very important element in that being in a place together changes the political stakes. It changes what's required of us in terms of building both capacities and solidarities. And I think, too, it has created a kind of visibility in the daily routines of city life in particular that wouldn't have been possible if it had been a march from A to B. And in that sense, moving from transient forms of protest to rooted forms, which is something that Naomi Klein talked about when she was speaking to Occupy New York, rather than chasing elites around the world, but instead actually trying to create an open-ended, not just encampment, but alternative society, exposed I think the breadth and the depth of the failure of current social arrangements. And I think the debate in Toronto was really interesting and important in that sense. It really revealed that a lot of the discourse about why people wanted St. James Park cleared out was because they felt uncomfortable walking their dogs in the park. I mean, there's a way in which, because those encampments were attracted so many people who were systematically marginalized by our economy, brought them together and actually accepted them being in that space with others who were actually still housed and had jobs but were sort of politically committed to the movement. It was a deeply uncomfortable, discomforting thing. it meant it was impossible for people to just step over and ignore the social crises that represented. And also, I think, is shamed the existing structures of social provision, that we actually don't have the capacity to meet people's needs, and this is a very visible manifestation of that. The tactic of prefiguration, which, you know, anarchists talk a lot about as a central part of their strategy, is important. Yeah. And I think it all, so, you know, creating in the present moment the alternative society that you want to build, and actually making it possible for people to begin to develop the capacities that would sustain that alternative way of living, is quite important. And I think it has shifted the debate around what kind of appropriate tactics are needed. I think it's remarkable that there was very little evidence of black bloc tactics in this protest cycle. Not none, but certainly not to the same extent. And most of the violence was police violence, partly because creating new social relations requires different kinds of tactics, right? Creating rather than defending or confronting is a different tactical terrain. The last thing I want to say is that, you know, I think that despite these important innovations, I think there is a lot of important unfinished business here. I think that in terms of the populist discourse of the 99%, there are really important contradictions in that identity that we can't but confront, right? That there are real class and other divisions within the 99% that, as we move forward and make strategic choices about what struggles to focus on, are going to come to the fore, right? The issues that face, you know, downwardly mobile, middle-class, university-educated kids who can't find employment are different from the displaced working class who have suffered from deindustrialization for the last 30 years. I mean, just to say one example. And so I don't think it's pedantic to say we want to confront the internal divisions within the 99%, not in order to privilege one or other set of interests, but rather to understand what the terrain, the strategic terrain is that we're going to have to confront to move forward. I think that there's also a romance of tactics here that we have to be careful of. That encampment in itself, while important as a tactical intervention in a particular moment, I don't think that we can or should make a fetish of. What I think is important about encampment is that it was a particular way to create an oppositional space, a space that cultivated and supported the development of oppositional consciousness and culture. But I don't think that that particular form of encampment is the only way that those kinds of oppositional cultures can be supported and fostered. So I think the challenge moving forward is not to fetishize tent cities, but rather to think about how do we create the kind of spaces that provided those dense and difficult but, you know, creative social and political interactions that I think was so much of so enthusiastically embraced by participants. I think that the question of alliances is a really important challenge. In Toronto, and I'm going to be done soon. In Toronto, you know, columnist for the Toronto Star, Tom Walcom, last year referred to something that I think is a really important term. He taught in talking about how the general population a year ago had centered its anger on elements of the working class that were organized, that had unions, that had higher wages and pensions, that the focus of their ire on those elements of the working class was a form of reverse class resentment. And I just think it's a very potent term to describe, in part, the rise of right-wing populism and its purchase amongst elements of the working class. I don't think that's gone away. And even though certainly Occupy has challenged the terms of those identifications, disturbed them, but I don't think that it has evaporated them. And I think that in particular, in moving forward, because I can say in Canada, in Toronto, attacks on the unions will continue to come. They certainly will be coming in Toronto in, minutes, as we speak, in fact. That the question of what kinds of solidarities were built as labor and other social movements gathered in those spaces is really important. Unions are inevitably going to have to fight on sectionalist basis, right? They are going to have to figure out ways to defend their members in the context of these attacks. Are we, as a left, are those struggles going to be allowed to remain sectionalist, or is the left going to actively work to reframe those struggles into the broader frame that Occupy gave us? And are the common experiences that people had, are they strong enough to bring people together around those struggles that will come in the months and year ahead? So I think I'll leave it there. But I guess I would say that this is really just, I think, the tip of the iceberg in terms of what kinds of lessons we need to grapple with from this last set of struggles. And I think we're left with, ultimately, the question of what kind of political agency are we going to create out of this cycle of protest? Is it going to be possible to build a set of organizations that have the strategic capacity to consolidate the ideological, tactical, and other kinds of gains that were put on the table, or not? I don't know the answer, but perhaps this weekend we might figure it out. Yeah, thanks.